Instantly grabbing central space and opening diagonals for the queen and bishop creates immediate dynamism. Sicilians immediately challenge central pawn control, creating complex pawn structures and dynamic play. Developing a knight immediately pressures the central pawn, preparing kingside castling and anticipating a flexible game. Developing the knight to a natural square solidifies central influence and prepares for potential pawn breaks. Asserting central presence and preparing d4, while potentially creating isolated pawn scenarios later. Establishing a central pawn presence, black immediately challenges white's spatial advantage, creating a rich tactical landscape. Sharpening the attack towards the weakened f7 square, the bishop exerts pressure that black must acknowledge. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing a central pawn push, this move maintains a robust pawn structure. Securing the center pawns while opening lines for the queen and king's bishop offers a flexible, positional foundation for white's development. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for castling demonstrates a prudent approach to defending the king. Securing the knight on d2 prepares for a potential kingside pawn push, subtly building central influence while keeping options open for further development. A patient approach aiming for long-term structural advantages rather than immediate skirmishes. Unleashing the bishop to g5 injects immediate tension, pinning the knight and preparing to disrupt white's queenside development should they choose to castle kingside. This bishop actively challenges white's central control, seeking to exploit potential weaknesses in their pawn structure or open diagonals later. Seizing the initiative, white aggressively probes black's kingside, aiming to expose the pinned bishop and create immediate weaknesses that could lead to tactical opportunities or force concessions in piece development. Retreating the bishop to the edge, creating a slightly passive outpost, allows white to potentially gain further control of the center and prepare for an aggressive kingside pawn storm with g4. Pushing the g-pawn now creates immediate space, potentially cramping black's bishop and driving it to a less active square, while simultaneously opening lines for your own king's Indian-style attack, though it does leave your own king a little exposed. Sacrificing the bishop's safety to temporarily relieve pressure on the kingside, but this retreat opens up the e5 pawn and creates long-term weaknesses on the dark squares around the king if white can exploit the pawn structure. Initiating a daring knight sacrifice on d5, white gambles on disrupting black's pawn structure and opening lines towards their king. This aggressive maneuver aims to exploit the slightly uncoordinated piece placement on black's queenside, potentially creating weaknesses that can be exploited later. The bold placement of the knight, though initially exposed, seeks to force black into difficult decisions regarding piece exchanges and pawn pushes. The knight's hop to e7 signals an intention to bolster the kingside defenses and potentially launch a counterattack, demonstrating a willingness to trade a bishop for pawn pressure. Opening up the knight gives white a chance to centralize the bishop, potentially pressuring black's kingside pawn structure while simultaneously creating a pathway for the rook to enter the game. Releasing the pawn tension opens the e-file for white's rook, and black's king might soon feel the chill with that diagonal now more exposed. Suddenly, the bishop targets a critical diagonal, threatening to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the king, all while asserting a new spatial claim. Black prioritizes king's safety amidst white's aggressive pawn storm. This repositioning offers an immediate refuge, potentially preparing to support the kingside defense or to launch a counterattack from a more secure base. Striking at the heart of black's pawn structure, this exchange dramatically alters the landscape, shattering the symmetry and potentially creating lasting weaknesses around the king. Re-establishing contact between your knights immediately after the exchange creates a beautiful knight outpost potential on d5, while also allowing your rooks to potentially eye the open c-file later. A clever repositioning, the knight embarks on a journey to the queenside, aiming to exert influence on the c5 square and potentially participate in attacks down the c-file, all while evading black's active bishop and clearing the path for other pieces. Black forcefully challenges white's central pawns, aiming to dismantle the knight's strong outpost on b3 and open lines for their own pieces. This creates immediate tension and a decisive moment for white to carefully consider their pawn structure and piece activity. The bishop's repositioning to *f4 initiates a fascinating structural exchange, leaving white with doubled pawns on the *b* file, but potentially unlocking the *d* file for a future kingside attack. Black's immediate riposte with the *d* pawn creates central tension, a common feature of this Sicilian variation where pawn structures often become asymmetrical and fluid, demanding careful calculation of piece activity and pawn breaks. This decision to capture on *f4* forces black to confront the doubled pawns directly, and the subsequent pawn storm potential on white's side of the board now hinges on how effectively the rooks can be brought to bear. Unlocking the central pawn tension now presents a direct challenge to white's bishop pair advantage, as the d5 pawn's advance has created a slight overextension and opened lines that black aims to exploit. Embracing the open files that have materialized, this recapture strategically reasserts white's control over key central squares, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed nature of black's king after its recent castling. Black's queen bravely ventures to the kingside, challenging white's advanced pieces and aiming to disrupt their coordination while preparing for potential pawn pushes in the center. Unlocking the queenside's potential, this repositioning aims to bring the bishop into the fray, eyeing black's somewhat exposed king and preparing for potential pawn pushes to gain space. Black's audacious raid on the b2 pawn, while superficially tempting by grabbing material, dangerously exposes the queen and ignores critical pawn structure weaknesses, potentially leading to a swift positional unraveling if white can exploit the open lines towards the black king. Seizing the open file with the bishop creates a clear tactical imbalance, forcing black to react defensively and potentially exposing their king's safety by disrupting their pawn structure. The rook's deployment to the d-file immediately challenges white's control and aims to disrupt the central pawn structure, seeking to exploit the weakened light squares around white's king, particularly after the recent exchange on c6. This queen redeployment is a proactive reaction to the exposed nature of black's queen, aiming to disrupt its newfound central presence and potentially create weaknesses. Black's pawn chain is now exposed on the queen side, potentially creating weaknesses for future exploitation, while white's pieces are poised for a more active role. White reclaims the bishop, a pivotal exchange that aims to exploit black's somewhat exposed king position and regain central control, while simultaneously preventing a potential pawn avalanche on the king side. A bold knight excursion to the queen side, aiming to exploit white's slightly misplaced bishop and potentially disrupt the pawn structure with a subsequent a6, b5. The king steps onto a more secure square, potentially preparing for future defensive maneuvers or to escape the immediate threats that have been swirling around the center, while simultaneously offering a slight reprieve from the exposed kingside position. Black's audacious pawn grab on c2, while seemingly opportunistic, opens the floodgates to white's counterplay along the d-file and creates significant long-term positional concessions by leaving the queenside vulnerable to infiltration. Initiating a queen trade while your king remains exposed to potential counterplay is a bold gamble, potentially simplifying the position, but leaving you vulnerable if black can exploit the open lines with their remaining minor pieces. Recapturing the pawn with the knight creates a fascinating, unbalanced material situation where black has a significant pawn majority on the king side, but white possesses a central pawn majority and the bishop pair, poised to exploit open diagonals. This knight fork is a clever tactical response to white's pawn sacrifice, but it immediately shifts the game into a complex tactical battlefield where precise calculation and precise piece placement will be paramount to navigating the upcoming exchanges. Reclaiming the central file with the rook immediately addresses the previously surrendered initiative and begins to contest black's central piece presence. The knight's unexpected sortie to e3, disrupting white's newly consolidated pawn structure and forcing the king out into the open, represents a critical turning point in this already complex positional struggle, potentially opening avenues for further tactical exploitation against the exposed monarch. The ensuing pawn structure, with its doubled pawns for both sides, transforms this from a standard tactical skirmish into a positional battleground, particularly for White's now compromised kingside pawn mass. It's a trade-off, sacrificing immediate pawn equality for potential open files and a slightly more active rook. A risky pawn grab that suddenly throws the position into tactical chaos, aiming to disrupt White's central structure, but potentially leaving Black's king exposed. Relocating the monarch to a more secure central square, away from potential pawn advances and discovered attacks, aims to consolidate White's position and prepare for active piece play in the upcoming middle game, potentially eyeing the weakened kingside. The rook's repositioning to the central file finally aims to activate a piece that has been largely passive since castling, hinting at an attempt to contest open lines and potentially target White's compromised pawn structure. Unleashing the rook to the semi-open column, a bold repositioning aimed at asserting pressure on Black's weakened queenside pawns and potentially creating infiltration opportunities. Reasserting the bishop's influence, Black repositions this piece to a more active square, aiming to control key diagonals and potentially unpinning the knight while challenging White's bishop dominance. Asserting pressure on the queen side, the rook now eyes the c-file and creates potential threats along the fourth rank, aiming to disrupt Black's coordination and potentially isolate the knight if it doesn't find immediate support. Initiating queenside expansion with this pawn thrust aims to create new attacking avenues and disrupt White's rook placement, potentially preparing for a future b5 push to challenge White's pawn chain. Asserting the b-file now forces Black to confront the doubled pawns and a potentially isolated piece. Sharpening the pawn chain structure along the kingside now, Black seeks to solidify its defensive perimeter and potentially prepare a pawn storm on the queen side. Re-establishing central influence and preparing for future piece activity, this knight repositions itself to a more active square, eyeing weaknesses in Black's pawn structure and offering potential support for an eventual kingside advance. Re-establishing the bishop's diagonal allows Black to survey the queenside and potentially bring pressure to bear on White's isolated d-pawn, while also offering a subtle defensive maneuver should White's knight try to infiltrate further. The rook's repositioning to the third rank signals a strategic pivot, aiming to contest the open c-file and potentially support advances on the queen side, while also keeping a watchful eye on the vulnerable e3 pawn. A bold foray into enemy territory, that rook suddenly finds itself stranded on the e-file, a tempting target amidst White's coordinated pieces. Black gambles for activity, but overlooks the immediate danger of being outmaneuvered and potentially trapped. White's queen and knight are poised to exploit this aggressive overextension, threatening to shut down Black's lines of communication and seize the initiative. Consider how that rook's isolation might become a critical weakness as the game progresses. Seizing control of the open file with the rook dramatically alters the board's dynamics, aiming to exploit Black's potentially exposed king by cutting off escape routes and creating immediate pressure. Seizing the open file with the rook is a bold, yet potentially precarious decision. While it disrupts White's pawn structure and eyes the isolated d-pawn, it also exposes the rook to potential counterplay if Black cannot quickly consolidate their gains. Unleashing the rook's power onto the seventh rank disrupts Black's defensive setup and immediately pressures the pinned knight, forcing a reaction and potentially creating weaknesses in their pawn structure. Unveiling the bishop to d8 aims to contest the now open c-file, a crucial battlefield where White's rook currently enjoys unopposed dominance. Clearing the second rank for the rooks, White aims to challenge the isolated pawn and potentially trap the Black rook after a subsequent advance. A bold declaration of defiance, this check injects immediate drama into a position where White's rook on the seventh rank seemed poised for decisive action. It's a desperate attempt to disrupt the simmering calm and force White's king into a more exposed situation, gambling that the tactical possibilities outweigh the inherent risks of exposing your own monarch. Securing the king under fire is paramount, and repositioning it to a safer square is the immediate defensive priority. This rook sacrifice is a desperate attempt to disrupt White's advancing king and potentially create some passed pawns in return for the lost material. By placing the rook so aggressively, black is hoping to force white into a defensive posture, delaying their natural development and consolidation. The long-term viability hinges on whether this forced activity can compensate for the material deficit, or if it simply overextends black's forces and allows white to capitalize on the exposed king. Bringing the knight back to f3 after all this maneuvering aims to consolidate white's defensive structure and prepare for potential kingside counterplay, albeit with a somewhat passive approach, given the rook sacrifice black has just pulled off. This repositioning hints at a desire to avoid further complications in the center and focus on stabilizing the position before black can fully exploit the open files and the exposed white king. It's a cautious step, acknowledging the recent aggressive exchanges and opting for a more measured response. Focusing the rook on the open file offers an immediate chance to disrupt white's already precarious pawn structure, potentially creating opportunities for further advances or piece exchanges. Shifting the king towards the center aims to activate this piece, a crucial step as the board simplifies and fewer pawns remain to protect it, potentially preparing for offensive operations or a more active defensive posture in what is evolving into an endgame scenario. Initiating a daring pawn thrust on the queenside aims to disrupt white's knight's activity and potentially open lines for black's rooks. Dislodging that knight from its strong central post, the knight now ventures toward the queenside, aiming to exploit any weakness on the a5 pawn and potentially disrupt black's king's safety. Pressing the advantage with that pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's rook and create an outpost for your knight, but it overlooks the immediate danger lurking on the kingside. Ra7 aims to utilize the open file, an aggressive push to pressure black's queenside and potentially isolate the pawn. This strategic gambit seeks to disrupt black's pawn structure and create weaknesses for future attacks. The rook's repositioning hints at a desire to control open lines and exploit any potential overextension by the opponent. The rook's relocation to the king's flank offers a tantalizing attempt to disrupt white's pawn structure, but it surrenders a critical central file that black desperately needs to contest for any hope of a comeback. The rook now commands the open 7th rank, a powerful outpost that severely restricts the black queen's mobility and begins to squeeze the life out of black's position. The pawn, now a significant threat, advances, forcing the rook to a more defensive posture. Let's disrupt the rhythm and see if we can force some new weaknesses. The bishop now occupies an active outpost, menacing the weakened white pawn structure and preparing to exert pressure on the queenside. The knight's repositioning now probes the queenside, seeking weaknesses in black's advanced pawn structure and aiming to disrupt the coordination of black's pieces. A valiant attempt to inject some life into a position that has become quite static. This move, by forcing the knight to retreat, aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially open lines for black's rooks. However, it overlooks the immediate tactical riposte that leaves black significantly down material. Seizing the open file immediately offers a significant positional advantage, challenging black's defensive structure and preparing to infiltrate their territory. Black's bishop now aims to disrupt white's rook activity on the 7th rank, seeking to exchange it and potentially ease the defensive burden on its own king. Activating the knight with a sudden flank assault aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and threaten immediate incursions towards the monarch, hoping to exploit the exposed king position. Unleashing the rook's power, this checks the king, forcing it to a more exposed square and setting up potential mating threats or forcing the exchange of valuable pieces.